Billions of people around the world live in extreme poverty. Nearly 1 out of every 10 people in the world lives below the international poverty line. That is 689 million people struggling to survive on less than $1.90 a day. And nearly 2 billion people, or 26.2% of the world's population, live on less than $3.20 a day. The extremely poor live without support on the sidelines, watching economic growth and prosperity pass them by. They are shunned by the world economy. They live lives abundant in scarcity, without enough food, access to clean water or proper sanitation, without access to safe shelter, health care, or education. Although the World Bank established the most widely held and understood definition of poverty, they have also described poverty as hunger, lack of shelter, being sick and not being able to see a doctor, not having access to school and not knowing how to read, not having a job, fear for the future, living one day at a time, losing a child to illness brought about by unclean water, powerlessness, lack of representation, and freedom. This understanding and description of poverty shows a broadening of the global definition of poverty, but it doesn't replace the World Bank's $1.90 per day standard for extreme poverty used to measure the global poverty rate. However, this narrows us down to the continent, Africa, and it is indeed heart-wrenching to know that 1 in 3 Africans live below the global poverty line. They make up 70% of the global poor, and their numbers are rising. Despite the overwhelming number of extremely poor people in Africa, the root causes of poverty on the continent are no different than the causes of poverty around the world. Poverty has been growing in sub-Saharan Africa due to the long-term impacts of external factors like war, genocide, famine, and land availability. Unless all these factors are addressed, the cycle of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa will gain momentum and continue to grow as each component of poverty reinforces the others. Welcome to yet another touching video segment here. Today, we shall be throwing light on the possible causes behind the persistent poverty in the African continent, steps which must be made to gear her in the right direction towards steadfast infrastructural and economic development as other developed continents. Before we get right into it, don't forget to smash the like button, share with family and friends, and subscribe to keep the channel growing. Africa, a continent pulsating with diversity, tells a tale of contrasts. The breathtaking landscapes contrasting sharply with the persistent challenge of poverty. Poverty in Africa is the lack of provision to satisfy the basic human needs of certain people in Africa. African nations typically fall toward the bottom of any list measuring small-size economic activity, such as income per capita or GDP per capita, despite a wealth of natural resources. In 2009, 22 of 24 nations identified as having low human development on the United Nations Human Development Index were in sub-Saharan Africa. As of 2019, 424 million people in sub-Saharan Africa were reportedly living in severe poverty. In 2022, 460 million people, an increase of 36 million in only 3 years, were anticipated to be living in extreme poverty as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and war. In 2006, 34 of the 50 nations on the United Nations list of least developed countries were in Africa. In many nations, GDP per capita is less than $5,200 per year, with the vast majority of the population living on much less. According to World Bank data, by 2016, the island nation of Seychelles was the only African country with a GDP per capita above $10,000 per year. In addition, Africa's share of income has been consistently dropping over the past century by any measure. In 1820, the average European worker earned about 3 times what the average African did. Now, The average European earns 20 times what the average African does. Although GDP per capita incomes in Africa have also been steadily growing, measures are still far better in other parts of the world. However, a nuanced exploration of historical, economic, and social factors might unveil a great deal the layers of complexity that have defined Africa's economic journey. 1. Historical legacies. The shadows of colonialism cast long over Africa's economic struggle. Centuries of exploitation and the imposition of artificial borders disrupted indigenous governance structures and hindered the organic development of diverse regions. The legacy of resource extraction, leaving local communities impoverished, continues to shape economic realities. Historical trauma of colonization echoes in the struggle for political stability in Africa. The arbitrary division of ethnic groups, often fueling conflicts, hampers social cohesion and economic progress. The stern, sad truth, however, remains that the imposition of colonialism on Africa altered its history forever. African modes of thought, patterns of cultural development, and ways of life were forever impacted by the change in political structure brought about by colonialism. The African economy was significantly changed by the Atlantic slave trade through the process of imperialism and the economic policies that accompanied colonization. Prior to the scramble for Africa, or the official partitioning of Africa, by the major European nations, African economies were advancing in every area, particularly in the area of trade. The aim of colonialism is to exploit the physical, human, and economic resources of an area to benefit the colonizing nation. European powers pursued this goal by encouraging the development of a commodity-based trading system, a cash crop agriculture system, and by building a trade network linking the total economic output of a region to the demands of the colonizing state. The development of colonialism and the partitioning of Africa by the European colonial powers arrested the natural development of the African economic system. Africa, prior to colonialism, was not economically isolated from the rest of the world. Indeed, African states had engaged in international trade from the time of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and West Africa specifically had developed extensive international trading systems during the eras of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These huge empires relied heavily on the taxing of foreign trade to finance government expenditures. The wealth of these nations was dependent largely on the trade in gold, but also on the levying of customs, taxes, booty from foreign expeditions, and fees associated with administrative offices. However, even more significant to the era of colonialism is the era of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade existed in Africa for over 300 years and introduced to the continent sophisticated systems of credit and exchange. Although these markets existed prior to the trade, the great increase in trading brought about by European demand for slaves stimulated their further development. Credit, debt in currency, and interest all developed apace with the trade. One result of the increase in international trade was that indigenous African economy was subordinated to the interests of Europe. The slave trading system did this by substituting European manufactured products for those products which normally would have been made locally. Thus, we see developing early a pattern of Africa as a source of raw materials, in this case, labor, and as only a consumer of goods. The result of such uneven trade is evident. Even innocuous imports, such as textiles, competed damagingly with local products, with the result that the technological gap between Africa and Europe, confined in the 15th century to shipping and firearms, widened to such an extent that African technology failed to progress. This pattern of unbalanced trade continued into the period of colonialism and remains today. In spite of this, local states still controlled the supply side of the slave trading system. In fact, It has been argued that the slave trade itself was an essential part of the development of some African states. The compulsions of the times were such that neither Europeans nor Africans had any alternatives but to engage in the trade. In any event, the development of the Atlantic slave trade forever altered the relationship between Africa and Europe. Unraveling these historical legacies is crucial for charting a path towards sustainable development. 2. Economic factors. Corruption, a formidable adversary, has been a persistent barrier to progress of the African continent. The diversion of funds meant for public welfare into private coffers undermines infrastructure development, healthcare, and education, perpetuating a cycle of poverty. Furthermore, many native groups in Africa prioritize family relationships over national identity, so people in authority often use nepotism and bribery for the benefit of their extended family group at the expense of their nations. For example, the Congolese president Mobutu Sese Seko became notorious for corruption, nepotism, and the embezzlement of between $4 billion and $15 billion during his reign. Despite this, corrupt governments often do better than authoritarian ones that replace them. For example, under Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, corruption was rife and poverty rampant. After his overthrow, corruption was lessened, but famine and military aggressiveness came to the fore. In any event, corruption both diverts aid money and foreign investment, which is usually sent to offshore banks outside of Africa, and puts a heavy burden on native populations forced to pay bribes to get basic government services. Tackling corruption becomes not just an ethical imperative, but a fundamental prerequisite for economic advancement. 3. Global economic dynamics. A closer examination of Africa's integration into the global economy reveals imbalances in trade relationships. Unfavorable terms and conditions often favor external interests, limiting the continent's ability to capitalize on its abundant resources. Debt burdens, sometimes incurred under questionable circumstances, constrain fiscal flexibility. Between 1960 and 1997, foreign nations sent over $500 billion to African nations in the form of direct aid. The consensus is that the money has had little long-term effect. The Cato Institute, an American libertarian think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., argues this is because, rather than increasing development, financial aid creates dependence on foreign investments. For example, as of 2005, the budgets of Ghana and Uganda were more than 50% aid-dependent. In 2002, then President of Senegal, economist Abdoulaye Wade, stated, "I've never seen a country develop itself through aid or credit. Countries that have developed in Europe, America, Japan, Asian countries like Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore have all believed in free markets. There is no mystery there. Africa took the wrong road after independence." In addition, most African nations have owed substantial sums of money. However, a large percentage of the money was either invested in weapons, money that was spent back in developed nations and provided little or no benefit to the native population, or was directly misappropriated by corrupt governments. As such, many newly democratic nations in Africa are saddled with debt run up by totalitarian regimes. Large debts usually result in little being spent on social services, such as education, pensions, or medical care. In addition, most of the debt currently owed, approximately $321 billion in 1996, represents only the interest portion on the debt, and far exceeds the amounts that were actually borrowed, although this is true of large debts in developed nations as well. Authors Leonce Ndikumana and James K. Boyce estimated that from 1970 to 2008, capital flight from 33 sub-Saharan countries totaled $700 billion. most African nations are pushing for debt relief, as they are effectively unable to maintain payments on debt without extending the debt payments indefinitely. However, most plans to forgive debt affect only the smallest nations, and large debtor nations, like Nigeria, are often excluded from such plans. However, it's been remarkably observed that in Africa, large sums of money are often used to develop mega projects when the need is for smaller-scale projects. For example, Ghana was the richest country in Africa when it obtained independence. However, a few years later, it had no foreign reserves of any consequence. The money was spent on large projects that turned out to be a waste of resources. The Akosombo Dam was built to supply electricity for the extraction of aluminum from bauxite. Unfortunately, Ghanaian ores turned out to be too low grade, and the electricity is now used to process ores from other nations. Storage silos for the storage of cocoa were built to allow Ghana to take advantage of fluctuations in the commodity prices. Unfortunately, unprocessed cocoa does not react well to even short-term storage, and the silos now sit empty. Another example of misspent money is the Aswan High Dam. The dam was supposed to have modernized Egypt and Sudan immediately. Instead, the block of the natural flow of the Nile River meant that the Nile's natural supply of nitrate fertilizer and organic material was blocked. Now, about 1/3 of the dam's electric output goes directly into fertilizer production for what was previously the most fertile area on the planet. Moreover, the dam is silting up and may cease to serve any useful purpose within the next few centuries. In addition, the Mediterranean Sea is slowly becoming more saline as the Nile River previously provided it with most of its new freshwater influx. Addressing these systemic issues demands international cooperation and a re-evaluation of trade practices. 4. Social challenges. Delving into the fabric of African society exposes deep-seated challenges. Colonial exploitation not only stripped Africa of its resources, but also dismantled existing social structures. The imposition of artificial borders divided communities, fostering internal strife and hindering cohesive regional development. Moreover, access to education remains uneven, with marginalized communities disproportionately affected. Healthcare disparities contribute to a cycle of poverty, as illnesses hinder workforce productivity. Addressing the historical legacies requires acknowledging the multifaceted impact of colonization on both a macro and micro level. 5. Division, conflict, and war. Of the world's 20 war-related conflicts in 2013, 11 alone were fought on the African continent, all in sub-Saharan Africa. This includes the wars in Sudan and South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, Mali, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic. In the crisis regions, agricultural production usually comes to a standstill. Many people flee who are forcibly expelled from their homes and are dependent on outside help. Poverty in Africa is on a steady increase as a result of these wars. What does this really tell us? Aren't these conflicts and wars in the African states mere fruits and prevalent symptoms of a source? Colonization in Africa left deep scars, disrupting local societies, creating arbitrary borders, and exploiting resources. The imposed boundaries often ignored ethnic and cultural realities, leading to tensions and conflicts among diverse groups, forced to coexist within artificial borders. Economic exploitation further fueled disparities, contributing to ongoing struggles. The legacy of colonization continues to shape Africa's geopolitical landscape, playing a role in some of the conflicts and divisions witnessed today. 6. Mismanagement of land. Despite large amounts of arable land south of the Sahara Desert, small individual land holdings are rare. In many nations, the land is subject to tribal ownership. Many nations lack a system of freehold landowning. In others, The laws prevent people from disadvantaged groups from owning land at all. Although often these laws are ignored and land sales to disadvantaged groups occur, legal title to the land is not assured. As such, rural Africans rarely have clear title to their own land and have to survive as farm laborers. Unused land is plentiful but is often private property. Most African nations have very poor land registration systems, making squatting and land theft common occurrences. This makes it difficult to get a mortgage or similar loan, as ownership of the property often cannot be established to the satisfaction of financiers. This system often gives an advantage to one native African group over another, and is not just Europeans over Africans. For example, it was hoped that land reform in Zimbabwe would transfer land from European landowners to family farmers. Instead, it simply substituted native Africans with ties to the government for Europeans, leaving much of the population disadvantaged. Because of this abuse, foreign aid that was destined for land purchases was withdrawn. Historically, such programs have been few and far between, with much foreign aid being concentrated on the raising of cash crops and large plantations rather than family farms. There is no consensus on what the optimal strategy for land use in Africa may be. Studies by the National Academy of Sciences have suggested great promise in relying on native crops as a means of improving Africa's food security. In the midst of these challenges, Africa showcases resilience and innovation. Grassroots movements driven by community leaders exemplify the potential for self-reliance. Sustainable agriculture practices, harnessing technology for development, and fostering entrepreneurship highlight the continent's adaptability. Amplifying these success stories, acknowledging and supporting local solutions, becomes integral to shaping a more optimistic narrative for Africa. Africa's journey out of poverty requires a comprehensive, collaborative approach. Addressing historical injustices, combating corruption, and fostering inclusive development are vital steps. By recognizing and amplifying the continent's strengths, both internal and external stakeholders can contribute to a more equitable and prosperous Africa. In doing so, Africa's narrative can evolve from a story of struggle to one of resilience, innovation, and sustainable progress. This brings us to the end of this video. What are your thoughts? Share it with us in the comments section, and we would be happy to respond. Don't forget, most importantly, to encourage our efforts by leaving a like down there. Share our eye-opening contents with family and friends, and subscribe if you are yet to. Thank you for watching.